Well, hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on whereabouts you are. Thank you so much for joining Cathy and I today for this webinar. So we're all sort of gathered here today to talk about clinical trials, which are, of course, the main way that we're going to establish which treatments are safe and effective for treating patients with ALS. And for such a long time, it's been traditional to think about these in purely scientific terms, purely about p-values and statistical design and what have you. But I think our experience has been that it's about far more than that. It's about what is important. It is about what is the measurement of significance. It's about what matters to the community. And really the only way we can ensure we're doing a good job there is by ensuring that we're actually talking to the people living with or affected by the condition itself. And so therefore it goes beyond a question of the pure science. So our sort of hosts for today are Sano Genetics, and Sano is a company that works in a variety of research programs. There's over 20 research programs they're working in now, really focusing on precision research. So there are some neurological diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. There's some of these newer, more common diseases like long COVID, and they've been working with some very high-end population scale genetic biobanks like the 100,000 Genome Project in the US. So for now, like I say, there's a few neurological diseases in there. Keep tuned for some hopefully future work in ALS, sort of watching this space later. But the types of things that Sano really invests in are participant platforms to sort of engage with people who want to take part in research, to make people aware of trials, and then particularly if there's a genetic target for that trial, to get people tested at home with a simple spit kit. So rather than having to come into hospital or anything like that, they can take part in a pre-screening genetically much more easily. Sano is able to access medical records to check against eligibility things. And then we can also actually engage with people, as they're considering taking part in different forms of research. So you can find out more information, obviously, at the website. So in terms of today, we're going to have sort of two sections. So my name's Paul Wicks, and I'm going to be walking through about 20-25 minutes of slide content about how patient involvement sort of needs to look in ALS trials, in my view, as a researcher, as an advocate, as a caregiver. And then I'm very pleased to be joined by my friend Cathy, who is also probably known primarily as ALSadvocacy. In fact, I think your credit cards and your checkbook probably say ALSadvocacy all over them. And then Cathy is going to sort of respond a little bit to sort of what I said and bring some of her reflections and experience. And then, of course, we'll look to our Q&A. In terms of my disclosure, so I'm an independent consultant, so I work with a range of companies. Some of the ones in bold here are directly involved in ALS. And for that reason and other reasons, just to be clear, I'm not going to be talking today about any particular drug company's program, any particular drug company's progress or expanded access programs, or what have you. Just don't think that would be appropriate. So hopefully what I'm talking about today is maybe universally applicable. And the idea is that, for each of these programs, if patients were more involved, we would get more of what we want to see in each individual case. So who on earth are these people? One of them with a funny accent. So I'm a nerd, as you can probably tell, and I did my PhD starting about 20 years ago at King's College, London. So what I was looking at was what is now relatively well accepted, but this concept that in ALS, it's not just the motor neurons that are affected, but also the brain. And that's been problematic for people to acknowledge because Charcot, the French neurologist who sort of named ALS, said that the brain's never affected. And if you look at a lot of the literature, it actually says the brain's not affected. The problem is about 15% or more of people actually do have some behavioral changes as a result of ALS. And they're not just due to worrying about the future or maybe not working as much or whatever. They are actually due to changes in the brain that are related to the disease process. So I was studying that for a number of years. Whilst doing that, I also got very involved with a website called Patients Like Me that some of you may know. And I actually moved to the US and worked as the head of research for a number of years and did a bunch of research collaborations with leaders in the space in MGH and Duke and King's and Oxford and places like that. But Patients Like Me was really all about saying, well, let's actually put research tools in the hands of patients and letting access to the ALSFRS, which in a research context is not typical. You don't typically tell people what their scores might be or compare them to other people. Patients Like Me actually gave these really powerful, almost registry type tools to the users themselves. So I feel like I'd sort of been fairly deep in the world of ALS, and you know, I have to say I sort of thought I knew what I was doing because I'd read pretty much every piece of clinical research that had ever been written about ALS, and then something totally unexpected happened, and that was that from 2013 up to about 2015, it turned out that the slow foot drop that my father-in-law was experiencing would go on to progress. And to eventually be diagnosed by my friend Martin Turner at Oxford as being a slowly progressive form of ALS. And so this is my father-in-law with my research assistant here from a few years ago. And so they live 10 minutes down the road, and you know, my wife and I obviously provide as much support as we can. And so we've been going through the journeys that many families in ALS have been going through, and it won't be any surprise to hear that it's, you know, extremely challenging. And as it turned out, I didn't know anything about ALS really. Until, you know, I was sort of right there, sort of as it happens. Cathy's an advocate. Sometimes we can be, you know, afraid to be bold and take action and rock the boat. Cathy is not afraid of those things, and I think that that's great, and we're very lucky to have her on our side. So we'll be hearing a bit more from Cathy later on. So I suppose, you know, the way I look at all the clinical trials is to say, well, you know, obviously the scenarios in which people are living and that they have a progressive condition without effective treatments might suspend some of the typical rules of how we expect people to behave. But if you were made this offer, what would you think? So a huge drug company that, you know, makes more revenue and profit every year than a typical country would like to offer you a job, and it's an unpaid job, and you're only going to take it because of altruism, because you're such a lovely individual. If you are picked, you're going to be selected to frequently travel to a busy city in the middle of the week. You know, please come to London on a Monday morning at 9 AM. It's pretty tricky, actually. You're going to have all sorts of painful testing procedures. We're going to stick needles in you and take 12 vials of blood and all this kind of stuff. You're clearly going through a lot. Well, we're going to give you a piece of paper where you're going to be asked about your depression and anxiety and all sorts of things on a little tick box. No one's actually going to listen to you, and it's not going to be an empathetic conversation. We're just going to download it all into quantitative data. And you're going to have to arrange all your own travel and meals. You know, please keep your bus tickets and receipts and parking things, and maybe in about 90 days to a year, we might reimburse you by check if the accounting system approves them. But we're not going to cover childcare, or, you know, if you have to rearrange your spouse's or your child's work, or, you know, all the different people that have to get in place so that you can come and take part in a study. That's on you. Okay, we're not going to work on that. About half of you, for all this work, we're actually going to give you a placebo. We're going to give you something we know does nothing, because there's this thing called the placebo effect. We haven't figured it out yet. We're not investing an awful lot in it, but this is how we're going to solve that problem. And we're not going to treat you with a great deal of respect. We're going to call you a subject. I mean, that's not a great compliment to the people that would be volunteering for this, but, you know, we're scientists, and we went to medical school for a bit because we were good at memorizing things. So, you know, we're going to talk about people that way. If the drug works, well, we're not going to continue giving it to you because we have to make money from it. So then we'll take it back, and then we'll hopefully find a way for it to get paid for. And by the end of that, maybe you can buy it through your insurance company. So, and even at the end of the research study, where you've been giving the data and you've been giving all your time and you've been, you know, rearranging childcare to come in, we're not actually going to give you the results of the study because, you know, we don't respect you enough to give you those answers. We'll probably put them in a PDF in a peer-reviewed medical journal that will come out in a year or two, and we're not going to publish it open access because really we only want a handful of doctors and regulators to read it. So if you want to read it, you're going to have to pay $40 to download the PDF for 24 hours, right? So this is not such a great deal. And of course, you know, the drug will only be made available if we get quite a high enough price, despite the fact you're being unpaid. So just looking at it objectively, I am not that surprised that we sometimes struggle to get people to take part in research. And through my work with, you know, companies and CROs and sponsors and researchers, I've been trying to understand why it is that we got into this position. So for those of you from industry, you'll be very familiar with this. If you're more from an advocacy point of view, this may be kind of a mess. So I'm not going to go through it in tons of detail. But essentially, part of the reason that job application for the healthy volunteer or the clinical trial participant is so poor is because of the process that we have for drug development. So in the early stages, we start off with thousands of potential treatments, right? We have these sort of analyses of the scientific literature, or we have kind of storage cupboards full of possible chemicals that could work, and it's expensive to rule them out, right? It costs us resources to try and figure out which ones pass through different assays and light up as potentially, hitting neurons in a particular way or getting past the blood-brain barrier. And every time we're trying to rule things out, it's very costly, very expensive. We narrow it down to a smaller and smaller series of candidates, but when we're doing this, it's either in what's called in silico, so in sort of computer simulations, or in sort of animals that are things like, well, even before animals, it could be cells in a dish, up to simpler animals like zebrafish, up to mice, up to sort of other, up to animals. And it's not actually until we get to what's called first in human trials that actually we go from sort of animals to humans. And so much has had to be so tightly controlled to get us to this point that I think one of the challenges is we don't have a big enough firewall to go, right, these aren't guinea pigs anymore. These are people, like your mum and your sister and your friend. And so we're going to have to treat things differently. And it is not just a science experiment. This is a social contract that we're engineering. And then, of course, initially the phase 1 is usually just for sort of safety and pharmacokinetics and dosing and that type of thing. And as we get larger and larger and larger, they're not always as large as 1,000 people in ALS. This is the point at which we're trying to figure out, is this successful? Is this something we take for regulatory review? Goes off to the FDA, and many of you will be very familiar with the types of processes there. And then the new therapy doesn't sort of come out until that point. And of course, there's great variability across different countries. So if people want to sort of follow up offline, I'm happy to point to some resources about sort of how drug development works, but this is the only time I can get it in one slide. So apologies if that was a bit too much or a bit too fast. So where in this process do the sponsors and the big research groups really involve patients? In my experience, 20 years, goodness knows how many trials, I would say it's here. After years and years and years and years and years, we start recruiting for a trial, and we were hoping to get 300 people in 2 years, and we've got 150 people. And then the question is asked, why is my trial not enrolling? Then we might come back to the drawing board and say, well, why don't patients want to drive 200 miles, for no gas money to come to my clinic once a month to fill out questionnaires they could have done over the telephone? I wonder why that is, right? Or at the point that actually something's about to launch, sometimes we might hear from the advocacy side, hey, could you please lobby for my drug? Please come and tell FDA, please come and tell payers what a terrible issue this is and why they should do more. And the reality is where they should be engaging with patients is a lot earlier. And when we look at other diseases like breast cancer and rheumatoid arthritis and rare pediatric diseases, patient involvement or patient public involvement, PPI, means that patients are involved as co-producers of this work. Let's zoom all the way back to when we were looking through the cupboard, right? When we had all these thousands and thousands of candidates. Should we work with patients and caregivers to ask the strategic framework, where does this drug fit within the portfolio of things that we need? How much of a priority is it to slow the disease down to 20% versus could we ameliorate symptoms? Could we strengthen things? Could we lessen pain or what have you? If someone's doing sort of a Me Too drug, is that really the best use of resources? When we're designing a protocol, yes, it can have all sorts of interesting scientific gobbledygook like brain scans and things. What's the burden of doing that? I have been laid flat with a line in each arm for a PET scan for 3 hours. It's not fun, right? And of course, I don't have ALS, but the burden that we're putting on people for that discomfort is often put secondary to some of those interesting research points or the sort of outcomes that are included just in case they miss something, right? And then, when we see patients really being involved, they can help with things, not just as sort of informants, but actually to be active parts of it. So, for example, in the I-SPY2 breast cancer trial, there was a group of 40 women with breast cancer who were on the ethics committee, they're on the data steering committee. They were helping to do the cultural translations from English into US Spanish in a way that's probably better than having sort of professional medical translators from a contract research organization or something like that. So this is the opportunity that I think we kind of have here. And like I say, I think that the gap, why this is, to be clear, no one in industry, no one who designs trials is stupid or evil or not aligned to the ultimate end goal of patients. But they work in systems with different incentives, different traditions, the inertia of hundreds of years of practice. That's probably what gets us most of the way there. And going from cells to zebrafish to mice, they're different disciplines of research, they're different disciplines of science, right? We don't make this leap and suddenly go, we need some psychologists here, we need some qualitative researchers, we need some patient advocates to come and reset our assumptions on what we saw in mice and pancreases and what have you, right? So it's about pulling through the patient voice before, during, and after the development of medicine. So one framework that I found is really useful for this is called Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. And what it tries to do is to sort of, I guess, grade the level of patient involvement or citizen involvement to different levels. So at its worst, if a company was actively lying to trial participants, we would see sort of therapy or manipulation and therapy here as sort of lying to people and then lying about the lying. And sadly, some cases like that were identified in a book called Bad Pharma by Ben Goldacre, and there are others who've commented on this. To be clear, I don't think any of this is going on in ALS, but just to say some of the protections that exist in ethics and in funding and transparency and conflicts of interest do so because of this history of which we have to be very conscious. The next stage up is tokenism, right? To say, well, we're going to do 100 bad things, but we asked some patients and they asked for us to take out 2 of them, so we'll take out 2 of them, right? Well, that's placating people. That's because I still hold the decision about whether or not I'm going to make those changes, right? And having, like in I think the FDA's case, a very small handful of advocates that took years and years to vet, during which time those people sadly became too unwell to actively participate, is tokenistic, right? It is not getting at that level of co-production. There are some good signs. I mean, I think the patients included movement, which has popped up in conferences, journals, that type of thing has been quite interesting. And seeing big flagship leaders like the BMJ, which now has patients as peer reviewers of its research, or some funders which actually have patients living with medical conditions helping to decide where grants should be allocated and how they should be allocated, is a clear idea of delegated power, right? So when you're peer reviewing a piece of research, you're not just being consulted as an informant, but you actually have decisional power about whether or not you make a recommendation to the editor to accept that. And you're on the same level as the scientist or the statistician or the doctor who's also been asked to comment. So it's giving up some of that power. And then at the higher end, what we could see is things more like citizen control, right? Where the community themselves come together and start talking about how some of these things should be, how resources should be allocated. I think AM ALS is one of the best examples of that in recent years and have made incredible progress, but there are also obviously plenty of other organizations and movements that we've seen over the past 20 years or so. So if you weren't convinced that it's a good idea to do from moral, ethical, practical reasons, I have, I guess, a couple of other categories, right? So one is the carrot. So if you were the chief financial officer of a business and you wanted to understand, well, is listening to patient engagement, patient involvement, getting patients involved, is it worth the extra hassle and the extra time it might take? An analysis by Citi that works a lot with the pharmaceutical industry and the CROs, so to some extent this is more of an industry voice, actually talks about a very significant return on investment. And the reason for that is if you design your trial better, you are going to have less times when you fail to enroll. You can have fewer people drop out of the trial because it's too burdensome. And you're going to have fewer times where you need to go back and change the protocol, which is extremely expensive. Right? If you have documented your ethics committee at the 50 different states in America where you're recruiting patients, and now you've changed it to say, well, actually, we're going to send people on Uber, so we've had to change the recruiting message. You've got to send that out to 50 places and wait till they've approved it, and right? Much better to prevent those issues up front than to deal with them later on. A more academic group doesn't find as big, as pronounced an effect. It's very difficult to do research on research, but again, significant improvements in enrollment and retention just from having sort of advisors from the community affected there. If the carrot's not enough, there's sticks. Sticks are on the horizon. FDA has definitely recognized that burdensome trials are an issue. There are large numbers, embarrassing numbers of trials in some areas like cancer that enroll 0 patients because of how burdensome they are, or because the inclusion-exclusion criteria rule out anyone except sort of fantasy patients who are, 70-year-olds with no comorbidities, with perfect blood pressure and no diabetes, and who can do cartwheels apart from this one disease they have to have. Well, those people don't really exist. So you're never going to find them, right? So FDA is recommending, for now, non-binding recommendations that stakeholders should engage with patients and other experts. Patient preference researchers here are being treated as equally to the statisticians. Trust me, trials do not get commissioned without statistical input. The idea that the sort of patient experience could be on par with that is good and important. That's a should. In England, the MHRA is considering changing the law to make it a legal requirement in legislation to have patient involvement and patient engagement. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see FDA strengthening some of these statements too. So, I think it's a good idea, but these carrots and these sticks, I hope, are motivating to people who are designing studies or running them at the moment. So why do patients with ALS take part in trials? Well, as you would expect, it is overwhelmingly about altruism. That is the #1 reason why, in this survey that I did when I was at Patients Like Me, patients say they want to take part in research. Clearly, they are also hoping for an opportunity to improve their own health, but we know that when you're taking an experimental medicine, it is an experiment, right? And we sadly know that there have been research studies where the interventional trial, the experimental trial, actually had a poorer effect on outcomes than the placebo or the standard of care. But after that, we do see big issues here with distance that people have to travel. And actually, Cathy has published a poster at the ALS Symposium on just how far people have to travel to take part in the research. And I think they make a lot of hopes and assumptions that they'll learn something about ALS by being a trial participant. And they're frequently disappointed by the fact that they don't learn much, because as part of being a research participant, the clinicians, the research team really aren't allowed to tell you very much about what's going on. And I think that can be quite alienating. We did a study with Duke and MGH where this is going back almost, more than 10 years now, but we put out a big email blast to our Patients Like Me members about a trial that MGH and the NEALS Consortium was running. And one of the things that surprised us was quite a lot of people sort of opened the email and looked at it, and then a smaller number of people sort of clicked on the sort of study website, and then a relatively small number of people actually signed up. And we were curious as to why that was, because I just showed you how altruistic and how interested people are in theory. But when you're doing something in practice, what's going on? So we surveyed those people, and we found that a lot of the reasons had to do with people's fears and concerns about the burden. Having a trial is almost like having a part-time job, if not sometimes a full-time job. Depending on what you've got, you might have a line in you, you might have all sorts of grapefruit juice you can't drink anymore. If you're childbearing age, you might have to change your contraception, all sorts of things, right? So big lifestyle changes. Some people would, I don't love this term, but shop around, right? Maybe this little phase 2 of a drug I haven't heard of, maybe that's not an exciting enough trial. Maybe I want to be in a phase 3 trial, right? And so people being more strategic, which I think is perfectly reasonable. One thing that was quite surprising to the researchers is about a quarter of people who chose not to enroll feared that there would be out-of-pocket expenses. And the researchers threw up their hands in the air and said, but we're paying all the expenses. We found that information was buried on page 26 of the informed consent document. And so sometimes this is not about spend a ton of money or change things. It's about take the salient information buried from the small print and put it on page 1, because that fits to the pain points of your potential participants. So, as a result of research like this, we tried to sort of incorporate this as much as we could and to share these learnings. So I did this work with the fabulously dressed Rick Bedlack, which many of you may know from Duke, and his work with ALS Untangled. And we tried to ensure that we could sort of build this in to some of the sort of standard guidelines. So for example, Dr. Bedlack and I worked on the revised Airlie House consensus guidelines with a number of others. And these are over 100 guidelines in how trials should be developed from over 140 leading clinicians and researchers. And these are just 3 selected guidelines from our subset, which was about patient recruitment and retention. Just to be clear again on how the guidelines work, there's 3 levels. There's must, as in you must. There's should, as in it would be a good idea, but no one's going to send you to ALS jail if you don't. And then may. And so these are the types of things that we had written into the trial guidelines. So for example, we should be publishing clinical trial results are published in open access journals. That feels like a pretty low bar to me. I mean, that's about $3,000 generally, so that it's open for everybody forever. Trials cost 10 million to 1.6 billion, depending on whose numbers you recommend. It doesn't sound like an awful lot of money in the grand scheme of things to ensure that participants and caregivers and doctors who don't work at universities can read your research. I think we took a lot of input from people through this process to ensure that there were interesting and dynamic ways of doing trials. I think the platform trials that we're seeing are excellent examples of these, but very reasonable concerns about trying to have as few people as possible taking placebos. And then, there's actually a much longer set of guidelines here, but, I can't yet quite tell whether or not these are really as standardized as some of the other things that are in there, because they're a should, and because, in 100+ guidelines, these are the types of things that can get buried a little bit. I spoke earlier about AM ALS. These are what was known as the Morris Principles. Here's Sandy Morris. You must listen to her because she has this tank thing. It's got treads, and presumably she can mount rocket launchers and lasers on it and stuff like that. So aside from the fact she's fantastic, this is a good reason to do it. And very similarly, after a lot of consultation with the community, we see a lot of overlap here between these principles and what we see in, say, patients included. So Cathy and I and others have been working on these ALS fellowships to ensure that people living with ALS can be supported to attend these meetings, sometimes to learn, sometimes to blog, sometimes to ask awkward questions, sometimes just to make researchers think twice about calling people subjects when one of them sat there in the front row in front of you. So sometimes it's a psychological, sociological effect as much as others. I would love to see it as standard that people living with ALS are much more involved in these teams. And one of the things I like about AM ALS is their bluntness in saying, well, we have rapidly progressive conditions. We might not always be the exact person here at year 7 of that study, but we will work on this sort of, I guess, revolving door, Sandy's called it, of kind of bringing people in, mentoring them, ensuring that the next generation is teed up to continue the work, right? Essentially, it's passing the baton. And I think that's so key for the sustainability of these initiatives. As people literally lose their voice, we can't have that involvement disappear because we say, well, in year 1 we work with this person, they're not able to participate anymore, so we'll stop listening. That's not reasonable. AM ALS has spoken much more about expanded access programs and other things, and this thing about sharing data, sharing methods, sharing best practices is really key, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. One of the things I love is that the idea that the community itself, in this sort of citizen control kind of higher aspect of Arnstein's ladder, is actually grading and rating the patient-centricity of different studies. And actually, you can go online on AM ALS's website and see the types of things that will get you sort of a high star rating. So optimizing the access to people as soon as possible in the research trials is a major part of it. Trying to make sure the inclusion-exclusion criteria aren't so restrictive that it's like trying to catch a falling knife in terms of, how recently you were diagnosed, and this Goldilocks level of sickness where you can't be too recent, can't be too fast, can't be too slow. It's quite excluding to a lot of people. And when you're using a measure like the ALS-FRS, which can change depending on whether or not you're taking scopolamine or you've got a power chair or what have you, people are not always getting a lot of a chance to do things. And this final one about sort of reducing travel burden. I mean, I've hit this a couple of times. In some senses, COVID-19 has been, one force for good has been sort of resetting everybody's expectations around use of Skype, use of electronic data collection methods. So it's gone from being quite out there and wacky to, we had to do it for a couple of years, and it turns out, the sky didn't fall. And so I think we're seeing that a lot now. And so decentralized clinical trials are going to become a lot more normalized. That doesn't mean doing all of the trial procedures at home, but more of a hybrid type of thing where you will get some things at hospital, scans and blood draws and things like that, but other things like questionnaires or even strength testing and things like that can happen at home. So if you had a trial, or you were designing a trial, just to be practical for a second, other than focus groups or some of the things that are sort of there in the sort of patient-focused drug development programs, what are some of the typical methods we've seen used? Well, one of the clearest is getting feedback from one person would be good, a statistically representative sample of people would be better, but to break down that 200-page protocol into the patient-facing elements. What's the aim? Is this to slow disease, or is this to make breathing better or pain reduce or something? Is it a 2-year study or a 5-year study with extensions? How often do you have to go there in person? Are there any changes you might have to do to, say, contraception or things you can't eat or drink? These are the elements that are sort of patient-facing. There's rarely more than 12 to 15 of those that are really sort of deal breakers or could be modified. So boiling those down to bullet points, showing them to people, even in a Survey Monkey or a Google form or whatever you have, and then getting their feedback. So does this element increase your interest in taking part, decrease your interest in taking part? And if people want to write some optional text about how they could make it better, you'll get a ton of suggestions. The typical things that I've seen, having done this about 30 times now, people want better arrangements for travel expenses. Ideally almost like an agency that would support their transport, and there are some of those available. They want to do more of the things that they could have just done at home on the telephone, electronically or what have you. Think of the caregivers. If the poor caregiver's got to be there for 10 hours give them a meal voucher, make sure there's Wi-Fi, make sure there are chairs, because it can wear on them. They might have a medical condition too, right? And so they are the informal support structure that keeps the whole thing kind of going. One of the things we have done, and often, I mentioned earlier, you can ask people about their interest in general in research, and they'll say they're super interested. Then you show them a specific trial, and they say, no, I don't want to do that. Asking those two questions in parallel, so that the general interest first, and then show them this sort of protocol that you're thinking of doing, and then say, well, what's your interest in this specific protocol? Well, if you sort of take the scores of the general interest minus the specific interest, and what you're left with is how much of an opportunity you have to improve the design of your study in order to maximize recruitment, maximize retention. It's about far more than one decision. It's about far more than the decision to enroll or not enroll in a study. As you go through the whole process from your first screening visit to after the trial ends, every little decision you make to take that pill, fill in that questionnaire, go to the clinic, call them up when something's going wrong, is helped by green things. If it's easy, if people are nice, if they call you proactively, and there are barriers that exist from the red things. You're waiting around on chairs a lot, or some of the staff are a bit grumpy, or they're rushed off their feet, or you don't always see the same people. These are issues which, at the end of the day, could grind people down, and as much as they'd like to, be committed to the science, actually to give up or to become frustrated. You do not have to invent this yourself. There are free toolkits available. Things like the Study Participant Feedback Questionnaire are free for use, have been well validated, are supported by academia, are supported by commercial sponsors, CROs, that ask standardized questions. You can even benchmark how your trial is doing against other people. So you don't have to invent this yourself, and this is a broader movement. So, I think I would encourage people to think about this if they work in industry across their programs, not just in ALS. And then afterwards, I think what I was saying earlier about if the trial works and you're in it, then sorry, we're going to take it away from you. I think that's not reasonable. I think we need open label extensions, both for real world evidence and for the safety and for the longer term monitoring. But also, it's just, I think the decent thing. We must have a plan to communicate study outcome to participants. They mustn't be reading on the front cover of Wall Street Journal the first time they learn what has happened to them. It's not reasonable. We need to develop lay summaries in multiple things. Again, we're spending significant capital on doing these trials. If you can't find some lovely little marketing agency to make up some TikToks and some YouTubes and some infographics and some blogs explaining how the trial went to the people that did it, then I think we have a problem. And I'm not saying dumb it down, but I'm saying make sure that people understand it. Maybe it's available in multiple languages, that it's really communicating and ensuring that everybody knows how it went. When research is finalized, it takes far too long to come out. We should be using preprints. COVID-19 has showed us things like medRxiv means that we can go much, much faster, and we don't need to sort of wait around. We must use open access. We must upload posters after we presented them at conferences. Cathy and I have been to a lot of conferences. You go and see a poster and it's got interesting findings on it. If you either didn't memorize it or take a photograph of it, that's gone forever. And the abstract in the abstract books is not enough information to be useful. We must be uploading these posters, which often cost, again, lots of money to put there, into places like ResearchGate and Figshare. We should be presenting at conferences that have patients there. Organizations like the BMJ no longer attend conferences that are not patients included. They no longer fund them, they no longer sponsor them. I think it'd be a great movement from the sponsors in the ALS advocacy communities to say, yes, it's very important that our key opinion leaders and our scientists are informed of things, but if we're not communicating to patients, we're not engaged in the community, what you'll get is backlash, what you'll get is misinformation, what you'll get is a rumor mill on the forums, and that will be unconstructive for a lot of what else you're doing. It's pretty easy to record your webinars, pretty easy to record your presentations. I'm doing it. If I'm doing it, the sponsors can do it. The researchers with multiple doctorates can do it too. And I think we should be doing more of the sorts of Q&As that we see, say, the Healy platform trial doing. Right. This type of engagement is successful in the COVID-19 research. It's a big reason for a lot of the engagement. Okay, so I've made the case that we should probably do this. I'll level with you, it's hard. It's hard to find a representative group of people. It's hard to take your protocol as it's coming together and you've just got it all perfect with the chemists and the statisticians and the logistics and the budget, and you've argued to your bosses. And now here's this awkward person from the internet saying that you should go and speak to 100 people and get patients involved. yes, that will be more work for you, especially the first time. Okay, and sometimes it'll be difficult, and sometimes it'll be awkward, and sometimes legal and compliance reasons make it challenging. You have to overcome those hurdles, and as you become more used to doing this, the benefits will accrue very, very quickly, and there'll be unexpected benefits that I can't tell you in advance what they'll be, otherwise I'll just tell you. But they'll save you millions, and they'll save you a lot of heartache, and they'll save you years, I think, if we actually do them. And ideally, what we would have is shared practice, shared community of practice, so that we learn from one another. I'd love to see a special session at the ALS Symposium every year, lessons learned in improving trials from a patient-centricity point of view, right? That would be something we can do. We could standardize to a sort of common set of practices that we use. So I've run through a lot today. Trust me, this is going on outside ALS as well. It's going on in oncology and rare diseases and cardiovascular diseases and whatever. And the good news is we can leverage a lot of what's going on there. So organizations like NIHR in the UK have been leaders in this. Things like the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or CITI, are making lots of resources available. There's a whole movement called patient-focused medicines development, which shares an awful lot of resources there. And then I pointed to the sort of Transallerate questionnaire. So the good news is we're not the only field here in town. This is a much broader movement, and I think it's really up to us to get on the train and join in, and I think reap the benefits of all that getting patients involved in our studies will have us. Great. Well, I'm going to take a pause from PowerPointing and turn over to Cathy. Cathy, do you want to briefly give a minute or two of your background, and then maybe come in and see if there's any strong Cathy reactions you have for anything I've said so far?
Thank you, Paul. I have a sheet of paper here with just random things that I've written down. So this is going to be a wandering journey with me. I'm Cathy Collet. I'm in Indianapolis, Indiana. We lost Mom to ALS 25 years ago. I also have a background in the pharmaceutical industry. So clinical research is really important to me, and I've tried to stay involved in the changes over the years. And to Paul's point, 25 years ago, I mean, pharmaceutical companies knew that it was important to have patient engagement. They just didn't know what it was. I mean, they were struggling with who do you get? They would bring patient groups examples of the trial that's starting to enroll patients. Isn't it great? Well, that's not making any changes. So it has evolved over the years. There've been a lot of good intentions, and as our grandmothers all taught us, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We really need results. So, and I think there have been some results in the last few years. Paul, on one of your slides at the very beginning, you said that, you know, patients find that if it helped them, they can't have it for free. And in ALS land, sometimes they can't have it at all. And I think that's one of the things we've, over the years, taught patients to ask as you're looking for a trial: what happens to me if this stuff works for me? And different trial designs will have different answers to that question, but you need to know the questions to ask. And as you think about it, you know, Paul talked a lot about recruiting. You're recruiting. You're looking for the patients that, well, they're not looking to be recruited. They're shopping. So it's like two different activities, and they're really very different. And I think that the clinical research world has not been very good at understanding how to fulfill a shopping experience. They're looking around, they need information. I think that there was something, that it was the Duke study, that the survey that you did. If I get an email from Hilton Hotels telling me that we're opening a new hotel in London, I'm not going to click and make a reservation. I'm going to think, oh, that's interesting. Do I want to go to London? And then I'm going to look around to see if there are other hotels that might be a better deal than this great deal at Hilton. I mean, so I think that these emails that go out and try to target people for trials are exactly the wrong way to go about it. I think they're not presenting what people with ALS, and I take people with ALS to be representative of a bigger space of people with rare, serious diseases who have an interest in clinical research, but they need more information, and they need to make this shopping kind of experience much more efficient than it is. So just some things. You had a slide there on the Airlie House guidelines. And I don't know if people know that that is actually a conference center in the United States. That's how those guidelines got their names. And I've often thought that we'd have a much better name if they'd been at a Disney property. But I don't, Paul, were you there inside at those meetings?
So I was there remotely. I think there was probably some screaming children in my arms, and I was dialing in remotely at the time. But it was a very rigorous process from a scientific point of view. We did this thing called the Delphi process, where you have to, everything that was in there, I Boy Scout promise, is backed by evidence, right? So we would go and hunt through the literature, and so everything that is in there as a should or a may or a must is there for an evidence-backed. It's no one's one person's opinion. So it's hard to do, and it took years to come through. But yeah, it's you know,
there was not great patient representation in the room,
right?
But there was an audio feed, and there were about half a dozen of us on Twitter listening to the audio feed. And at one point, there was a suggestion that at some point in the clinical trial process, there should be a committee put together to do something with it. And a fellow with ALS on Twitter said, shouldn't that have a patient on it? And Dr. Kiernan from Australia, who was inside conducting a panel on the meeting, must have had his phone or something open to Twitter, saw that and got that patient voice into the guidelines. But it shouldn't be that hard, you know, but it just
and it shouldn't be random, right? It shouldn't be random. It should be top of mind.
Shouldn't be that hard. So it's just kind of interesting. I think we're making progress, but we still have a ways to go. I have a big note in the middle of my paper here that says not a single voice. There is not a patient voice, and I think that's really important. And one of the comments pointed that out too. Patients are not a monolith. I think it is not productive to try to reach consensus like that. Sometimes the best information that we work out when I work with Sandy Morris and other people with biofarms it's when we've tried to go through the problem and looked at different attitudes and different opinions about the problem. That's where if you're looking for a neat process and a lot of kumbaya, you're not going to get as much out of the process as you are if we really can work out the differences in opinions. The National Health Council in the US, which is it's an organization of organizations, about 8 years ago, they put up on their main webpage, "We are the patient voice." No, you're not. There are patient voices. It's really rough for organizations to try to kind of come up with that blended patient voice. And I think sometimes it's the voices plural that are so important in terms of getting the diversity of thought out on the table. Some things you mentioned, caregivers. Stephen Winthrop, I'm sure some people here knew him, a wonderful man with ALS, lived in the Boston area and signed up for every study he could. And most of the studies in the US are in the Boston area anyway, and was constantly in research studies. And his wife made a comment that it's a caregiver journey too. And she said they would go into these appointments that would run on and on and on. And she said, nobody thought about somebody has to go home and put the dog out. Now that's a really practical aspect of clinical research, that you need to have caregivers in the conversations when you design these things to figure out what is going to be practical for people. So just a couple of random thoughts, you know, when you talked about time is money, I believe that. I think people who get into clinical trials, especially the early enrollees, they're going to be really good at getting their friends in the trial because they want to fill that trial up and get it finished. And it's really important for them to have a smooth experience. If they have a bumpy road, that's going to make that trial drag on longer because it's going to be harder to fill. And then the other thing is, we hear sometimes when we ask for things, we can't, like expanded access, which I think is extremely important. And we, for years, heard we can't afford it, we can't afford it. Well, turns out, doggone it, time is money. You can afford it because your trial's going to fill faster if it has that feature for the people who can't get into the trial. Because people with ALS actually are looking out for their friends who can't get into trials. And, you know, maybe you can afford it, you just didn't budget for it. And we need to get companies thinking about it sooner and sooner. So those are some of my thoughts, I'm glad you brought up the PaCTD rating system, and that is not rating the science, that is rating the humaneness of the trial. It's really important, and to kind of prove that that works. When they first rated trials, there were trials with 4-star, 5 is the maximum, and there were trials with 3 stars and some really bad trials with 2 stars. And a 4-star trial company approached the group that did the ratings. This is, how do we get 5 stars? That's it. I mean, that tells the story. They're interested too. They want to rank well in terms of humaneness of the trial. And I thought that was a really good story, that yes, it does have an effect. So Paul, those are my random thoughts from my people.
No, not at all random. Thank you, Cathy. I think that's great. And you know, there's some conversation going on in the chat, and as you said, and as you were saying as well, there is something there about, you know, who is the patient voice and who represents the patient voice. I will not breaking any confidence, but I'm telling you that I've been in the room with multi-billion-dollar corporations where there were 40 scientists and researchers all sat around the room, and they pointed at, you know, Steve in the corner and said, well, Steve is the ALS expert. I was like, brilliant, why is Steve the ALS expert? Because he used to be a drug rep, and he once sat in one neurology clinic and saw one patient get diagnosed. So he's the person we talk to tell us what patients want.
Paul, I've seen another mistake, not as egregious as that, but another mistake that I've seen pharmaceutical companies make. And that is that, like, if you're working on an ALS trial and you have employees who are working in clinical trial design who have serious diseases, or they have relatives with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, you think they can represent that patient perspective. And they can represent a patient perspective, but it's important that you have people with a specific condition that you are designing that trial for, because they are going to be looking for things that even somebody with another serious disease isn't going to see. So I think that's extremely important. One thing too that I had written down, and I really mean to mention, is the whole process of informed consent isn't very informative. And I think we need to make that a much better process and a much more open process. And if anybody's interested in working on that, I would love to work on that. So thank you.
It should be an ongoing process, right? And I'll never forget. One of the first patients we consented for that neuroimaging study I showed you at the beginning, you know, was a person living with ALS, and my colleague said, well, we're just going to go up to the cyclotron on the roof of the building, and we're going to make some antimatter, and then we're going to inject it into your brains and then put it into a 3D spectroscoper that's going to recapitulate the information in a sun microsystem. And she's like, okay, that's not taking informed consent. That's flim-flamming people with big science words, right? And you know, really what this was about was the doctor was saying, trust me. And really, that's what these links are about. They're about saying that we have a scientific process. We've got your best interest at heart. You've got to trust us that this is right. We want to give you all the information we can. But you know, this consent process, you know, can be withdrawn. We see people pulling out of studies, or even sort of not giving all the data, or not necessarily even taking all the medication. We know that people aren't always adherent to the medication that they're sent home with. So we see these signs of disengagement with trials. I think the point on sort of patient voice and representativeness, you know, industry is actually very well set up to do this. When they want to understand what key opinion leaders think, they have methods and techniques to pull together key opinion leaders, so doctors who are advisors, and there are processes in place, processes to reimburse them, processes to make sure that's legal, processes under the Physician Sunshine Act. So there are mechanisms there. It's just that most companies haven't got that thing in place, right? So the first time they're doing it, they go, what does legal think? What does compliance think? And of course, if they don't have a template, if they haven't done it before, then their instinct is to go conservative and say, oh, this sounds scary. Talking to patients, not sure we can do that. So, you know, the good thing is going off to things like the patient-focused drug development groups and City, I hope will give the reassurance that this is becoming increasingly common. You know, another version of the what do patients think is asking doctors or nurse practitioners, the clinic coordinators. I love those folks. They're not patients. And even if they've seen lots of patients, I now know that when I saw patients come to the hospital, for example, and see the doctor for 20 minutes, there'd been a 3-4 month build-up to that 20 minutes. And you're coming to have your problem solved, right? And you're putting a brave face on. And this impression that patients are cheerful and positive and stoical, they might be when they're in front of you at clinic, Professor so-and-so, who's got all the answers. They're not in the car journey home. And that's the point at which they're deciding whether or not to take part in the research. So, I think as professionals, we're sometimes too keen to say, well, I see lots of patients and this is what they think. I'm not sure we really know, and unfortunately, it takes a degree of humility to keep saying, I don't know. And even if you did, even if I know what's right for patients in 2010, patients in 2022 are different, right? What's a 25-year-old ALS patient with a genetic family history that's, sharing information with groups on TikTok? Her experience could be so radically different to the bulk of patients that I've seen over the last 20 years in the UK and Boston that I have no right to speak on her behalf. And really what our role should be is being the patient experience researchers, that each time for each question say, well, what's the right representative decision-making process that we can help facilitate here? And I think that's sort of a profession that needs to come into play and be part of these teams. So I want to make sure we look at some of the questions here as well. I think we've got one or two sort of in the chat. Someone did speak earlier about the sort of the Arnstein's ladder of engagement, and I agree. There is a lot to unpack in there, and there's a whole bunch of of studies that I think have gone into more detail about saying whether or not that's really the right thing to use. There's this organization called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute that would use it quite a lot in some of the work that they did. But I have no particular skin in the nonprofit game. I will say there are lots of charities, there are lots of nonprofits, and so I think it becomes a challenge to say, well, who is representing whom here? And if you're designing a study, it would be much easier to engage with an organization than to try and make up your own pool of people every time. And so I think it must be tempting to say, well, we'll just go and speak to nonprofit 1 and nonprofit 6, and then it's done. Cathy?
Well, I think it's so easy to want to pick people whom you think are going to make it a smooth, productive process to a quick result. And sometimes those voices that are annoying are the ones who can help you find things that you thought you couldn't do that you really can do. So I think it's really important that the diversity of voices be recognized, and not to shut people off just because they're not as pleasant and cooperative as perhaps some others.
And, again, I like them very much, but some of the clinicians are pretty awkward, and we make exceptions and accommodations for them. So, again, we should have the practice there. So yeah, and I mean, I think one of the challenges of the fragmentation of the nonprofit landscape is to some extent the fact that the hopes of say the PaCTD criteria for AM ALS would be that if there were sort of bargaining power, if there was one group that represented them all like a union, the risk of sounding like a communist here, then actually collective bargaining, that these are a minimum standard, would be a powerful statement. We often look to the HIV advocates of the 1980s for some of our inspiration, and actually they did take a more sometimes militant, some would say, stand on some of this stuff. So again, I think there are much more significant drivers. I think the carrots are enough of a driver. I think the sticks are enough of a driver. I think the ethical, moral, business reasons are enough of a driver. But I could see a situation in which new cohorts of Gen Z or Gen Alpha potential participants coming through could form more of a union, really, a union of patients, and say, we demand these minimum criteria, otherwise we're not going to participate.
It's been interesting, Paul, watching the Morris Principles as they've unfolded, because those were designed after the Denver principles that the HIV activists did, and it's been interesting to watch the reactions to that. And then also, and one of my big interests is, as you said, patient involvement in scientific meetings. I think, if you really believe in the Morris Principles and that patients to be allowed there, it's really tough to see an ALS researcher who accepts a speaking engagement at a conference that does not include patients. And it's just, we need to get our patient voices heard so that people start realizing that this is serious stuff, and it's not, people with ALS are not going to hold the science back. They're actually going to help you find solutions that we've obviously not found to date. So
absolutely. And the people who are living with the condition now, and the caregivers, before they happen to pick up this flag of patient, they were accountants and CEOs and marketing executives and geniuses, and right, like, we can leverage that. There's more of you all than there are of us professionals, and if we're not using that human capital, more fool us, right? There's a wealth of experience in that community. We had a question on the Q&A asking, might it be a problem that if we, we might soon have too much almost competition for participants, they might be spoiled for choice. I think that's true. I think that's especially true in the genetically inherited or sort of conditions associated with particular genes. Whereas, if there's lots of trials going on in SOD1 or C9, then yes, people might have choices, and it's going to become harder and harder and harder to find those. We certainly see in conditions like, say, multiple sclerosis, and there's dozens of trials going on in a place like Boston, that people really are sort of making strategic decisions there. So, if there were a common standard of experience as a participant, you're always going to get picked up by Uber, there's always going to be a nice hotel if you're tired, then we're not competing on the experience, and that's a baseline. Then the science should speak for itself.
Paul,
do you want to come in on? I'll let you have the last word, Cathy.
Well, I'm sorry, a couple of caregivers, actually, we call them seats on the bus, the number of seats on the clinical trials bus. A couple of caregivers went through and actually counted them up recently, and I believe the total was well under 1,500 in the United States. So if we have around 30,000 people with ALS in the United States, there are less than 1,500 seats on the bus. So right now, we have not enough seats. They're not in the right places, but we don't have it's not a supply and demand imbalance where there are too many seats on the bus. It's actually not enough seats on the bus and not having the bus accessible to so many people.
Right. And, to be clear, we want the same things that sponsors and researchers do. We want there to be more trials. We want to make this an investable area, right? We want more resources to continue coming into ALS and building on the great successes of the Ice Bucket Challenge and the advocacy work that's been done in the US and the UK and elsewhere. So, well, thank you, Cathy, for your time and for your very non-random reflections. Thank you to all of our participants for coming today and for having a busy and active chat. As I say, I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation. If there are particular things you'd like to follow up with, you want comments on my side, feel free to get in touch. I'm on Twitter, Cathy's on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn or what have you. And watch this space. It's a really rapidly evolving discipline that we're talking about here. And I hope that in 5 or 10 years, we're talking about this as business as usual. And was it ever thus? That's what I hope to say. Thanks so much. Good to see everybody. Bye now.